Welcome back to Ripple Effect Connection. I'm your host, Kristi Hujik, a health and performance coach and level 3 integrative health practitioner. This podcast is all about connecting you with the messages and messengers that can truly change the trajectory of your health. Today's conversation is one I think so many women will see themselves in, because at some point life stops responding to effort the way we expected it to. You can do all the right things, show up, carry responsibilities, solve problems, push through, and still feel yourself in a season where endurance alone just isn't enough. And that's where this conversation begins. Today, I'm joined by my sister-in-law, Sharon Hujik, a keynote speaker who works with high-achieving women navigating the moment when competence no longer creates control and something deeper is required. This is a conversation about regulation, responsibility, and the quiet daily choices of who we become when life doesn't go as planned. Well, this is a ripple effect connection first, where I'm speaking to another person with the same last name. So I'm actually speaking to another Hujik, my sister-in-law, Sharon. So Sharon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Kristi. It's good to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you because I know everything that you have to offer in this journey is going to be really critical to what some of my listeners are dealing with on a level. So I always tell people that no matter where you are in your journey and what's going on, you can apply a lot of this to your own personal situation. And I think yours is one of those situations. So if you want, you have your own podcast called Rising to Resilience, which you were kind enough to have me as a guest on. I just want to talk about why you created that. What's the backstory that got you to this point?
Gosh, you start off right with a hard question, Kristi. Well, first off, thank you. It's a treat for me to be part of your community and to join you here. I've admired the work that you're doing, for many years now. And it's fun. There's not too many Hujiks out there. So to be able to hang out with you in this environment is really great. You're right. I do have a podcast that talks about resilience, and it's very autobiographical. I think most of us are using these platforms to explore things that are particularly interesting and important in our own journeys. I am a mom of 3 children. I retired from a kind of executive corporate when my firstborn was born back in 2008. So I have been a mom since then. And that journey has been complicated and challenging and beautiful. 2 of my children joined our family through adoption. And adoption by itself is challenging for families on lots of fronts. But in our case, that journey has also been characterized by something that's referred to and kind of well understood within the adoption community and children with special needs. It's called RAD, Reactive Attachment Disorder. And that it's almost like a traumatic brain injury caused by trauma. And our youngest child in particular has a very severe that. And parenting her has been complicated and heartbreaking and really challenging. She's an extraordinary young woman. She's beautiful. She's talented. She's funny. She's a superstar athlete. She does great in school. Yet she also brings into the equation a really complicated mental health diagnosis. And as her mom, and as many times it's been advocacy work, learning and changing the way I parent, but also, really fighting for resources. It has been kind of defining, like literally changed the trajectory of my life. And in a way that has surprised me and in a way that has really fundamentally changed me. And resilience comes out of that kind of clarity. I think you've experienced it. And a lot of other people who go through really, really hard things kind of look at like what happened and then pause to be like, what was this thing and how do I understand it and what do I do with it? So, that's the top level. I tend to be very careful about details. Obviously, privacy is super important, whether it's related to children or adoption or anything. So I don't tend to go into the nitty gritty about like specifics because it's easier and more appropriate for me to talk about the work I've had to do. And I think that's really what is relevant to other families and other women in particular, because when it comes down to it, like that's the only thing I really have control over is, the work, the changes that I've had to tackle.
And I think one of the things that you had to tackle was being an entrepreneur, yourself, and then having to shift from, you're a high performer, a type A, and then having to shift to this different mindset, no matter what in parenting, you have to shift that mindset a little bit, right? But then having to really shift because there are special needs here for the children. What was that part of the journey like? Because you're giving up a big part of you.
Yeah, gosh, it's funny. I talk about resilience all the time. Resilience is actually something I've always been fascinated by and interested in. I'm kind of Alex, your husband will laugh. Like, I've always liked history. He and I probably have that in common more than anything. Like, I love Churchill and I love Shackleton and this idea of like the grit and the perseverance and the overcoming. And even prior to parenting, like that was sort of a normal part of how I identified myself. When I was 30 years old, I took in my cousin who had run away from home and I like kind of rallied and raised her and got her into college and did these hard things. Golly, even international adoption, like that's just hard right off the bat. And then from a work perspective, like I was a really successful kind of, I was in sales and marketing. And when I retired, I brought that skill set with me and I did a lot of consulting and internet-based marketing, strategic planning, things like that. So resilience was just part of how I think it was baked into my DNA. And I had this really rich toolkit. I, had skills and talents and interests and work ethics and all those things, which you really lean on, I think, when you face challenges. I think the part about the specific nature, though, of what I've learned, specifically really in the last 4 years, is what happens when the natural resources that I had, that toolkit that I could draw on, you pull out of it and you come up with a new solution and you brainstorm and you fight another battle. And especially when it comes to mental health care, the battle is ugly. The resources are so hard to access. What happens when all those natural skills that I had weren't enough anymore? And I think it's true for moms. We're all, not moms, women. We're asked to be champions in so many different places, to be excellent at work, to be excellent parenting, to be excellent taking care of ourselves, and to just continue to draw and draw and draw from a well. I found myself about 2.5 years ago, literally looking and thinking like, I don't have anything left in my well anymore. My toolkit, which had always been so rich and so resourced, it was empty. And that's brutal. That moment of sort of looking at yourself and being like, I don't have it anymore. And a part of it is because of the challenges our daughter faces. Reactive Attachment Disorder literally is defined by not feeling safe, that human connections do not create safety and security. And as the mom of a child who's struggling with that, it's always a one-way street. It's always a giving and never receiving. And that is exhausting. That is confusing, just kind of, I can't even put words around it. It literally crushes your heart as a parent, because it's just, you're seeing somebody who's so important to you just struggle so profoundly. And the system, even those who really understand mental health challenges, they don't know what to do with it. So I found myself 2.5 years ago, my father passed away, really devastating loss. I'd been in this hard battle for advocating for my daughter for years and years and years. And things weren't looking really great. The solutions weren't helping, I guess you could say. And I had to really come to terms with what that was going to mean. What do I do when I don't really have anything left? I couldn't pull any more rabbits out of the magician's hat. There weren't any left. And that's actually the crux of what I am particularly interested in now, because there's something universal, I think, about that moment of people who are hit, and probably the people in your community that might really resonate with them. Like, what happens when just it's too much and you just hit that point of burnout? I mean, just anxiety, exhaustion, things aren't working the way they used to, whether it's your physical body or your mental health or what. And it's just devastating on so many fronts. That's the part that matters.
What were the signs like for you that like, I'm at my tipping point? Like, what were the maybe signs that you were experiencing that, hey, I am at the end of my rope
Yeah.
here. I can't do this. Because a lot of us, right, that are type A's, we push through, right? And this is what I deal with corporations when I'm dealing with it, right? These CEOs, you push every day. It's push, but there's going to come a day. It's not an if, it's a when. Sometimes when you're like that, it's not really negotiable. It's going to happen. So what were some of the signs that you're like, okay, I need to do something here?
Yeah. I'm sure everybody would say the signs were screaming. They happened slowly, and they happened actually because something bigger. I mean, I was in a crisis. COVID obviously was really damaging for most families, but for a family with a special needs child, it really threw us into a tailspin. The signs were probably the most obvious signs in hindsight was a really significant sort of narrowed vision of like, I have to save, I have to do this, I have to give everything I have. I'll give it a little bit of context. Our daughter was receiving care outside of our home because of the severity of her needs. And the resources in Virginia where we live are really limited. And honestly, I kind of think they're limited around the country. I have never spoken to somebody who has a similar circumstance as we do. And they're like, oh, well, in, California, they're great. Or in, Mississippi's really rocking mental health. I don't know that there really are great solutions. And they're all state-driven. Most of the public health solutions are state-based. And then what we have in Virginia is just hard. They're not great. But I had heard about a program that was on the West Coast that was known to be able to help children like my child. And I had to figure out a way to get her accepted into that program and then how to pay for it. And to say that that was like climbing a mountain would be like pretending you get wet when it's raining. Like it was brutal. And I remember a moment having come home from a really hard season and coming home from a vacation and sort of sitting down at my desk and thinking, okay, I have to do this again. I have to scale this mountain. Sort of taking a deep breath and saying, all right, like dive back in. And what I did was basically commit myself to 40 hours a week of advocacy work, contacting people, emailing people, searching for resources. And I cut myself off from most of my friends. I didn't have capacity anymore to talk to people. I stopped going to the gym. I wasn't sleeping. And honestly, probably the biggest, and I didn't notice it then, but I notice it now, like we're Christians. I couldn't make it through church without crying. I was just at that point where the wire was strung so tight that any emotion really hit too much because I was so disciplined and focused on getting her this help. And, my body, I gained weight. I couldn't sleep. I was also perimenopausal. So all of those symptoms were happening at the same time. But really, it was this kind of like, I am going to do everything in my power to get her this help. And I did. Miraculously, literally, we won the lottery and were able to get her into a program that actually could help her and has helped her. And if it was just that, and I had sort of taken that capacity then to say, great, I did it. I, accomplished this miraculous thing. I think that could have been enough for me to ease back. And I work with a therapist. I have a fantastic resource there. Unfortunately, right on top of that kind of victory, my father passed away. And then I literally just kind of threw myself. Got very dark and really heavy for a long time. And I think about that season now. I think about it. It's a phrase I use, and other people, I think it resonates. Like literally, like I melted.
Yeah.
Like I just didn't. That's what I talk about. Like I didn't have it anymore. Whatever was me that could always fix things, it just wasn't there anymore. And I had to then literally choose what, how do you rebuild this thing? And that's what I am fascinated now with a little bit of distance and a lot of healing to hear other women who have gone through similarly devastating experiences talk about that moment of like, something had to be different and something had to change. And the tools that I've gained now in terms of regulatory skills, mental health, self-care, all literally kind of grew out of that moment of brokenness, which I love the analogy of like a chrysalis, of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. But the part that actually connects with me the most is literally what happens in that transition. And we all know it from elementary school biology. Like, you have a very hungry caterpillar who goes and eats and eats and eats and eats, like Eric Carle in the children's book might say. But what happens in the chrysalis, literally that caterpillar becomes goo, sludge, and then has to like rebuild. That to me is what that experience felt like. Like, I am sludge.
Yeah, I get it.
I'm gooey. You do. And I think that's profoundly interesting. Like, if you can look at those moments and be like, I know what she's talking about. What is it then that we use to rebuild that's come out of that? And I love talking to other people who have had that experience, because the transformation of change that happens in that is profound. It's so hard, but it's so important. And that's the part of resilience that the rising piece of it is where my work is taking me.
Now, I think the difficult thing in your situation too is that you had some significant events hit you at the same time, but you're watching a loved one go through trauma, and then you're then in turn dealing with your own trauma, which is difficult. So what did you learn about trauma in general? Because I always love to talk to people about that who are kind of just digging into that for the first time. We don't realize sometimes the events that traumatize us, because trauma is such a big T word, but like there's little ways that we could have been traumatized our whole lives and been holding on to that. So what have you learned about trauma through all this?
Yeah. So on the large scale, I've had to become a student of understanding the impact of trauma, early childhood trauma, because I'm parenting children who have experienced profound deprivation in their earliest years. Attachment trauma literally is defined by the reality that my daughter's brain was formed in her infant years in a place of neglect. So the neurons in her mind, in her brain, formed in an environment where she wasn't getting fed, she wasn't being cared for consistently. If she cried, nobody came to help her. That's what a child raised in an orphanage looks like. So neurologically, her brain, it's similar to a traumatic brain injury. So that level of trauma neurologically is just part of what happened for two of my children when their brains were developing. I've had to learn a lot about that, because how it manifests itself when it comes to attachment disorders. And it's like a spectrum, like autism. Like some children have a very severe case, and some we all have attachments and attachment patterns, which is a fascinating field of study. And they're doing a lot of work on that. So I first really had to learn about what does this trauma look like, when then I had to further then learn what it meant to be in an environment that created so much stress and anxiety that it turned into what psychiatrists and psychologists refer to as complex trauma, where it's this ongoing exposure to a level of stress and anxiety and confusion, disruption that just sort of became our normal in a way that I couldn't have fathomed, because of the initial trauma that happened to our children. And what I realize now is just that constant tension of getting in the car and driving someplace, not knowing if we could make it there safely, going to a family event and literally seeing children collapse under the worry or the pressure of what could happen, with profoundly complicated circumstances kind of going into that. Just that stress created trauma. I have PTSD because of just living with that constant fear of, where are we going to make it home safely? That work, and I hesitate. It was actually very hard for me for a very long time to even say that. Because I would be like, well, I'm not a soldier. I mean, my brother-in-law went to war. Like, I think it's okay to acknowledge that trauma has many different versions and forms. I needed to sort of name it in order to actually be able to heal it. If I just continued to ignore the fact that my nervous system was so dysregulated all the time, I wasn't going to be able to fix it. I wasn't going to be able to, do the work. Obviously, again, I didn't go to war and I wasn't in a terrible accident that caused that pain, but it's real. It hurts. It's hard to recover from. And I think I'm glad that I'm aware of it now because I have a tremendous new well of compassion or empathy or kindness because I've experienced it myself. And I see it everywhere. So it's not rare.
No, it's not. It's everywhere. And I think we can simplify it. I think one of the things that I learned, and I think I shared this with you on our podcast, was you can't compare your journey to anyone else's. Mm-hmm. Meaning there is no well, it's worse for a soldier, or, I can't complain because it's for me, there's a lot of people worse off than me that were diagnosed with MS. Your journey is your journey. You got to own it. You got to own it. And trauma is about how you hold on to it. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's about how your body's holding on. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it was for me, a childhood where a guy knocked on my window when I was a child and it scared the bejesus out of me, thinking that something like that could have been held on to in a reason for why my whole life I was afraid to go, a reason why I was afraid to go to sleep. Well, you think that's not a big deal, but if I held on to it this long, it's a big deal, right? So it's letting everyone understand that when you feel these things, you shouldn't be saying, well, I don't have those problems. I don't have that problem. It's all how your body holds onto it. But the other thing is that nervous system dysregulation. What dysregulates our nervous system puts us in the sympathetic state all the time. Fear and uncertainty. It can be simplified to those two things. And what have you talked about? Everything you've talked about has been fear and uncertainty. So of course your body thinks it's being chased by a tiger 24/7. So I'm curious to hear, and look, this answer could vary for anyone. Your journey is different than mine and the tools that we use. So I'm curious for you, what were then the tools and the things that you found that you started to lean into, because the body cannot heal from the sympathetic state.
Right.
So what were the tools that kind of sent you on this path forward?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I entered into it as a parent who had a child who needed to learn those skills. I mentioned reactive attachment disorder. The most simple way, and obviously I'm not a scientist or a medical professional, but the simplest way to explain it is that her amygdala never turned off. There was a constant vigilance of something is dangerous. Right. And on the head of a pin, it could be, anger, fear, fight, flight, fawn, freeze were normal for her. Those were just the first reactions to everything. And for those of you who don't know a lot about reactive attachment disorder or wonder if that's a piece of their study, it can be a really intense mood swing. It can be dissociative, where out of body, kind of her mind would leave and her body would sort of be gazing out window, but her mind wasn't present. It could be just an intense fear, startle reflex, bugs that wasn't resolved just with that would literally cause running and fleeing or aggression. And the amygdala is a really useful hormonal, action center. But if it never turns off, it's very hard to have even memories or rational thoughts. So as a parent, it was my responsibility to help her learn skills that were going to be coping skills to help find security. A huge amount of work on bilateral stimulation, which is crossing the line in between your body and intentionally tapping, doing things that required in the engagement of senses. And a fascinating thing, the amygdala basically turns off your five senses. So in order to smell something, in order to envision something, to plan something, you would use that kind of brain hack to calm her down. And lots of just great little tools that we would employ to do that. I was using them to teach her how to do it.
But it was helping you.
Yeah. All of a sudden you realize, wait a second, I need to And breathing, somatic work is really important. But even just realizing in her dysregulated state, the solution that everybody says, and it's the easiest thing to say and the hardest thing to do, is that I needed to be regulated. I needed to establish the baseline with my emotions so that she could come and meet me. That's like the core fundamental treatment strategy. And it works very, very well. It's just really, really hard for me to stay regulated when you're constantly sort of having these very dysregulatory symptoms and aggressions and behaviors thrown at you. So, I think the key that I had to learn, and I spent years figuring out, is like, I have to go first. I have to be the one that masters my nervous system and stay present in my mental health, mental framework, because that's really all I get to control. You know that. I know that. Every person has heard it before. Like, I only have me. I can control my thoughts and I can control what I do about them, how I spend my time. But the reality of actually having to stay regulated, in situations that were life-threateningly scary was, people would say, like, well, Sharon, you stay regulated. And I'd be like, you try it. It's really hard, but it's true. It's fundamentally true that the solution to the problem is me maintaining control over my nervous system. And so here I was getting resources to help my child, but ultimately I couldn't be the teacher until I became the student of it. EMDR is really excellent. Trauma therapy is really excellent. But the coping skills that I've had to learn personally have pretty much been the most successful thing in terms of starting to claw my way back into a place where, we can function as a family again.
Yeah, and I think I know EFT tapping for me was huge to get over my fear. That's what I would do at night when I couldn't sleep. I used some hypnotherapy. I had a really great, an energy healer that I worked with. She had a hypnotherapy that I would listen to at night. It was like my whoopee. If I had any sort of dysregulation that I was feeling, I would put that on and I would always fall asleep. And I think one of the cool things is that things like that, binaural beats, can really help program your mind on the subconscious level too. You don't even have to consciously be like, I can fall asleep with it on and it's still doing its job because the subconscious knows everything. Right? So the subconscious knows all. But I'm sure this was uncomfortable for you because in what you were doing before all of this and what your instinct as a parent to have to put yourself first sounds like such a little shift, but it's a massive shift. So how hard was it to make that shift to understand? Because this is the hardest thing I see with moms. It's really hard to have them understand that you have to put the oxygen mask on first in order to be able to be there for others.
Yeah. I think it's actually even more nuanced. I think we all know that self-care is important and that my family does better when I'm healthier and all those types of things. I think the area that I was struggling with, and I have to be honest, like I'm a very accomplished person. I had a lot of success. I feel confident in saying like I'm a really good mom. I love my children. I advocate for them. I think there was a complexity to the fact that I didn't want to tell people things were as bad as they were for two reasons. One, it's really hard to tell people like, I can't do this. Something bigger than my skill set is happening. But it was complicated by the fact that there's this sense of like privacy. Like I wouldn't want to speak about somebody so important to me in a way that would be unpleasant, or you don't talk about things like that casually. But as the problem got bigger and bigger and bigger, like it no longer became easy for my circle of people to know what to do to help me. So I was finding myself in a situation where like I would share like, hey, we're having this struggle. And my really beloved family members and girlfriends and people in our church, were shocked. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I've done that. It was like, and you find yourself in this place where you're ahead in a horrible way of everybody. You don't know anybody else who is dealing with this. So it became like isolating and lonely. And it was no longer like self-care is going to fix this problem. This was like, I am on the point of a spear that nobody else felt like has ever done this before. And the key for me was finding other moms, therapists, resources where what we were going through wasn't rare, wasn't surprising. I mean, we had really excellent medical professionals where we live who said to us, like, this is at the edge of my experience. Like, that's how extreme our circumstances were getting, where really well-versed psychiatrists, therapists would say, like, I'm at the edge of my experience now. Finding people who, one, knew how to help our family, and two, finding the right women in my personal life where my hard days weren't shockingly, like, they didn't run or they didn't, in the best ways, like, I could share with them what was going on and they're like, oh gosh, that's tough. Not like, oh my gosh.
Right.
Run away. So self-care was complicated in the fact that, of course, I have to take care of myself before I can help. But the key in sort of realizing that, or being even able to implement it, was seeing the fact that if I could either make our challenges much worse or I could make our challenges better, the way I responded to dysregulation fundamentally literally could either add fuel to that fire or the goal, which is, be the baseline that she could come back to. And when I saw experts and learned from experts who knew how to do that and watched them implement it, it felt like this great, like, aha, like, these are people who know what to do in this circumstance. They're modeling for me how to handle this. Now I see what that looks like. Now I can observe the skill that I didn't know no one else could teach me. And I think that's, when it comes to self-care, it's tricky because you're in a circumstance as a mom of a special needs child where, they don't stay alive without us. I mean, literally, they don't exist. Their capacity to be, independent of us is really small. So self-care feels selfish, right? It feels like, well, how dare you prioritize yourself? It's a lie that it's selfish because without me, you can't do well. So I have to be in my best place to do it. But it's one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do. The good news is gaining the discipline of taking care of yourself spills over in so many beautiful ways, like giving yourself permission to eat well and to go to the gym and spend time in therapy and take breaks. I'm a really introverted person, so like being by myself really matters for my mental health. Those just things are, I'm a better mom when I do that stuff. It's, like everything else. If it was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it, right?
No, it's not easy. And then we're in a world that, but I think what you were describing about, I think I maybe shared, I can't remember if I shared it in the podcast with you or not, but like Peter Levine, who's really big in the trauma world, he's the gold standard of dealing with trauma, talks about how trauma is basically the present of the empathetic other. Right. And so what you're talking about, like it was re-traumatizing, like every time you had to go. So the second you feel like there's no one you can talk to about it. Like what you had to go through there, that's like another type of trauma, and finding your way. You're not alone, right? You're not alone, but finding your way to have someone else be able to share, they've felt this and they're on the other side of it. And I can be too, is important. And we talk about neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm a big fan.
But you saw your daughter's neuroplasticity in a negative fashion. But the good news is that the neuroplasticity can happen on the other side of it, which is something you have to go through. So what are your thoughts overall? I know you love talking about neuroplasticity.
I do.
So,
well, and I think that's the most, I'm a pretty well-educated person. I had no idea. And maybe it's just because I wasn't paying attention to it. But one of the things that's profoundly important for all of us is that our brains neurologically are basically creating neural pathways every time we experiencing something new, and imagining it sort of like a road highway system of like, this is a well-worn highway, this path, it's how our brains like default into behaviors. So it's how habits are formed. It's how, it's our brains basically shortcut information management. Like, I see that green light and I know it's okay for me to go. I don't have to think about it. I just act, right? Harnessing the power of neuroplasticity is the intentional kind of building of alternate pathways to rewire how our brain reacts to it. And that's what coping skills fundamentally are meant to do for my daughter and for myself. And when I talk about coping skills, I mean like the intentional use of a tool to calm down our nervous system in order to not fall into that default reaction of flee, fight, freeze up, or fawn. Like, those are just reactions, and using coping skills to ease our brain away from that. When you're in these habits of this is how I react every time, the idea that our brains have the capacity to form new neural pathways is this neuroplasticity. We were taught by some really excellent psychologists that there are windows of adolescent development where neuroplasticity is the greatest. Unfortunately, it's less so for my age people, and, old dogs, new tricks thing is because we have bigger ruts in our brains that are harder. It's not impossible. It's just different in terms of how the strategies are to rewire them. But in adolescence, there's big windows of neuroplasticity that we wanted it to intentionally tap into to find help for my child's, those paths, like to rewire them and what they are. But again, as the parent learning these to help my daughter, it was profoundly real for me too. Like, I get to decide what I do. I have a conscious ability to choose how I'm going to start reacting to things. And I have this idea, and I think there's something universal about it. Like, I can very clearly point to a moment in time where I felt like I have to make a choice on what I am going to do with the hard things that I have gone through. I refer to it in my head as this radical moment, this radical choice where I had to decide, like, with these really devastatingly disappointing things that didn't align with the vision that I had for my life. Was I going to be angry and bitter and crushed by them, or was I going to choose to be happy anyway? Which is sort of a silly thing to say, but I really feel like I had to make that fork in the road decision. Like, what do I do? And then choosing the happiness, the path of I am not going to let this destroy me. I want to have joy again. I want to feel happy again. Because when I was in that melting and that moment, those months, almost about 8 months of just depression and despair and heartache, where nothing that I had been doing was working, it was hard to imagine feeling happy again.
And these habits and patterns that happen, right? Mm-hmm. What I talk to people about, and I know my friend Dr. Georgia, who I just had on the podcast a couple of podcasts ago, she talks about this too. And I've done the same thing that she talks about. It's that you get these patterns and these behaviors that you've learned are coping mechanisms. And instead of getting angry about them, you say, look, these serve the purpose at the time. They were to help keep me safe, right? So instead of thinking of them negatively, you say to yourself, thank you. You thank them for what they did, because this was the mechanism, but now I have better ways. And then you release it. So this is all about processing and then releasing.
Right.
And that's a very, very important thing. So is that what you're saying? You've experienced that, right?
Yeah. It's funny, actually. I have traveled the world. Until I went through the trauma that I have, I could be on an airplane for 5 weeks and not pause. I now literally have to fight anxiety being on an airplane, looking out the window. And I've had to do that. Thanks, brain. I appreciate you trying to warn me that this is dangerous. Thank you. I don't need you to protect me. Driving on a highway over a bridge. Thank you, brain. I'm okay. I appreciate your alert, but got it. I'm good. But actually, and that's really valuable. I don't want to in any way undermine that. But the coping skills that I've actually had to exercise and practice is a lot more I think there's an awareness of it for sure. Let's say, for example, a stressful morning where transitioning from getting up to get ready for school and getting onto a bus, which in our family is a really stressful 45 minutes because there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of things that she doesn't want to do, and kind of getting her to the point where that transition is going to happen feels like D-Day. 4 days a week, pretty sizable effort to make that happen. And it's it is my choice to acknowledge, hey, I'm getting my buttons pushed right now. I have somebody who's trying to dysregulate me, who is snarling and snapping and choosing, to be pretty unpleasant. I see that happening. And in my head, the coping skill is just recognizing that my nervous system is being tweaked and twinged and triggered and all that. And awareness of that circumstance is the first step I have to take, where I move it from into my prefrontal cortex, where my cognitive brain is able to say, look at that, this is happening. And I'm not just reacting to it.
Right. That's exactly it.
I am noticing it and sort of acknowledging that this is happening. And then I get to decide, what do I do about it? When you think about like the psychological loop of like, you have a feeling that triggers a thought, and then the habit is you fall into that action. Interrupting the feeling thought cascade is that first moment of like, I have to be aware that this is happening.
That's that pause.
Yes.
That's that pause that I'm talking about, that you suddenly get, where you have this pause before you actually react. You're just, you stop and acknowledge and think, how do I want to respond?
Well, and that's the key. The truth is that my reaction to that could either make our morning much worse, or I can stay at this point where I'm like, buttons are getting pushed, words are being flung around, behaviors are getting big. And my best coping skill right now is to change the way my face looks, where I kind of like feel like I'm getting tense, and to go into this place and just have a really neutral, kind of soft face of support, of like, oh gosh, this is a hard one today, isn't it, kiddo? Versus my desire to get on, really tense.
Big difference.
Changing my affect and using silence is probably my most powerful tool. Not reacting, giving myself that 4 or 5 second, keeping your face really soft. And, I don't do it well every time, but that solves the problem, I'd say 75% of the time, where if I don't engage my body in the behavior, I do better in the mornings. I think anyone with a special needs kid knows, evenings, bedtimes, those are tough. Weekends, holidays, those are tough. Yeah, it's just awareness. And it is then kind of the idea of consciously choosing what the future will look like, what future I want to have happen. It reminds me of a really great thing I just learned a couple weeks ago from On Rising to Resilience, the podcast I host. I interview and talk to women who have gone through really hard seasons, whether it was breast cancer or divorce or, trauma, really hard childhoods, whatever it might be. And I was talking to this one woman who has a son who's struggling with PANS, which is a devastating illness. She was sharing something that she learned from her father-in-law, who was a search and rescue leader. So he would serve on search and rescue teams. And in a crisis, the advice that people would say, what do I do if I ever find myself in a crisis? He told her 2 things, and boy, it hit close to home for me. He said, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge that you are in a crisis. Acknowledge the circumstances that you are in. Just don't pretend it's going to get better. Own the fact that this is a crisis. And then in order to stay present in a way that kind of keeps hope alive, think about a future memory you want to have. And what was intriguing to me was that terminology of a future memory. Think about a future outcome that you want to have and hold on to that thought. So that's what I'm talking about in the mornings, with these challenging transitions or whatever it might be. Acknowledge, hey, I'm getting pushed. My intensity is escalating because something's pushing against me. But the future that I want to have is me staying calm, me making this easier, me making this supporting her through this transition. So that becomes my guidepost, what I am working towards. And that's just a coping skill of intentionally paying attention and then being in control of my responses. And when it comes to resilience, it's such a small fact, but it literally, you do that well one time, it gives you this buoyancy of all right, I did it once and it worked. Maybe it could work again. And maybe it could work the next time. Because there's a grit and there's a perseverance. My complex isn't ending. This is every day for the rest of my life. And, this is a long haul. So I have to then choose to rise into something better.
Yeah. And the vision is so important. It's fundamental, because that's how I start, even with my health coaching clients. That's what we talk about, because especially if it's someone who's been in an autoimmune loop for a long time, they can't see the other side. They're so far down into the dark. They can't envision being healthy. They can't envision doing things. I had a patient one time at the clinic. She had some pretty significant autoimmune diseases, and they were fairly advanced. But I said, what is, if there's one thing you could do, and you want to do, like, what would that be? And for her, it was paddleboarding. She wanted to paddleboard again. Well, by darn, it was 3 months in. Do you know that woman got on a paddleboard and paddleboarded?
Cool.
She took a photo and sent it to me. And I said, you keep that photo and put it in front of what, it's a vision of what you can do. She had a vision, she kept the vision, and she did it. Did it. So I think it's really important to have that. And I bet you that you're picking up things from all your guests all the time that are helping you, and why your podcast is therapeutic for you.
Of course. I think all of us, the reason we're forming these communities is because we want that. I need it. And the women that I'm connecting with crave it. Because there's something that sort of separates you when you go through that season of, like, literally, you're no longer white knuckling anything. Like, you got crushed. And then you're, like, emerging out of that, and you look around and you're like, is it just me? Am I the only one that now has this new understanding of the purpose of pain and hard and suffering? And, like, gosh, what was that? And I don't mean to, like, minimize it. It's awful. Yet I wouldn't change the woman that I am today. I don't, like, the changes in me are so fundamental in terms of just, I am completely different than I would have been 20 years ago. I'm just a different being. And I would not, I love Arthur Brooks, and he says, like, don't waste the suffering. Don't squander it. And it's, and I think there's something really important to, one, share with other people. Like, this is real. If you're going through that, there are other people who get it. I think there's something important about, I'm a person of faith, and not losing the hope that I have in my faith despite suffering, or feeling disappointed that the way things I thought were going to be are, completely different. I remember saying to God one time, like, this is not what I wanted. Like, what the heck? Like, how come this is so devastatingly disappointing and hard? And I feel like other people, there's something about that resonates. Like, yeah, we are going to be asked to do really hard things, and it doesn't mean we throw out these kind of big pillars of our identity just because everything went different than we thought. I really love the idea that there's something honest and authentic about the stories that women are willing to share with me, and there is a beautiful expression of hope and power, and just the tools that they've shared. I walk away every single week just, like, feeling like, oh, wow, I learned something. Now I know what to do the next time. Yeah, and you're part of that. I mean, your expertise in terms of the work that you've done with health and eating and how your body responds. I mean, all of that. It's important.
Yeah, and I'm glad you have that outlet and that way to share it with others, because that is the thing. Again, I look at some of the worst things that happened to me, and I say, it sounds silly to say it, but I say it all the time. It might be the best thing to ever happen to me because it changed me. It allowed me to create a way to help others. And I think you're going through the same thing, which is cool. Our circumstances are very different in a lot of ways, but very similar in a lot of ways also. Yeah. So I think the work can be different. So I'm just really glad that you have that and that you're sharing this.
Yeah. And I think that's, when I talk about this idea of literally feeling melted or crushed or fundamentally changed, I think circumstances, most people would say, like, this is a significant moment when something really changed in my life. I think about it, when I gave birth to my first child. Like, nothing could have transformed me up to that point more than that. The times when you have really, like, awe-inspiring moments of sort of God or awareness of something bigger than you. There's something profound about doing that. And hormones are a huge part of it, right? But ultimately, what I think my reality and what I know is that I get to decide what I do with that.
Yep.
And when it comes to this idea of resilience, it's not something that you're just born with and, oh, wow, lucky you just happen to be a hard worker. It literally is this reality of like, I have to own these responsibilities, the thoughts that I have in my head, the time that I spend, how I do it. I go first. I choose what I do based on, I can't control the circumstances around me. I can't even control my own child sometimes, but I can choose what I do. Reframing thoughts, using my coping skills, prioritizing my physical and mental health. Those things matter. And if I am going to rise like I want to, I get to choose.
Very much. It's well said. Well said. So as a fellow outlaw, and that's what we're called affectionately in the Hujik family, as we are the outlaws, but it's affectionate. It's very affectionate. I know that's been a lot, and I'm just glad that you've had these tools and that you've been able to do this. And I certainly know that this is something you have to do and deal with every single day. But I'm glad you have the outlets that you do. But right now, I would love to give people a way to connect with you. If they have a story they want to share or they want to reach out to you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yes, absolutely. So SharonHujik.com is my website. I do some public speaking. I have a podcast called Rising to Resilience. And I think the key is that when people are looking for community of other women who understand, there's that tension, especially between, when circumstances aren't going away. You just have to sort of come to the reality that my life is different now. That's a person that sort of struggles with pithy platitudes. Nobody wants positive psychology or toxic positivity that makes all of us cringe. Things aren't going to get easier, so I have to change. That's the person who I really would love to connect with. So you're welcome to send me an email, Sharon@SharonHujik.com, and I'd be glad to send you an application and see if your story is one that would be valuable to share with the rest of the community.
Well, this was awesome. It was a great conversation, and it was nice to hear, a little bit more specifics about your journey. So thank you for coming on and your willingness to share with everyone.
Thank you, Kristi. It's fun to be here.
That's a wrap for this episode of Ripple Effect Connection. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok @WholeHealthKristi. Let me know what resonated most or even what you'd like to hear more about in future episodes. You can always find full show notes and past episodes at kristihujik.com/podcast. And if this conversation was helpful, please take a moment to follow, review, or share the podcast with someone who could benefit. A quick review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a click of a like button on YouTube actually goes a long way in helping me continue bringing you the meaningful conversations that we have, like this one. Stay tuned for the next episode of Ripple Effect Connection. Together, let's create waves of change.